2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. Checking. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. Check 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10. 1, 1, 1, 1. Is okay? Thanks. Okay, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. Is a line, no? It's okay. Okay, thanks.
distingués invités,
distinguished guests, I have the pleasure, in the name of our Committee of Health Work of the Pan-African Parliament, to wish you all a warm welcome to this meeting, to this high-level meeting on HIV and AIDS. And this morning, we have the pleasure of having amongst us His Excellency, Mr. Motlanthe Dalima, former President of South Africa, and amongst us is also the Vice President of the Pan-African Parliament, as well as a certain number of MPs of the Pan-African Parliament.
Yeah. Distinguished guests, I have this morning the pleasure as Deputy Chair of the Health, Labour and Social Affairs of the Pan-African Parliament Committee to wish you all welcome you all with us this morning to this high-level meeting on this most important issue of HIV/AIDS. And this morning we have the pleasure to have with us the former President of South Africa, His Excellency Mr. Motlanthe Dalima. We have also the pleasure to welcome the second Vice President of the Pan-African Parliament, and of course, all of you distinguished guests. So I won't be longer, and I will ask my colleague, the Vice President of the Pan-African Parliament, to say a few words of welcome to all the participants here. I thank you.
Bonjour tout le monde. Je vous souhaite la bienvenue.
Good morning, everyone. I welcome you in the chambers. I thank our President, who is amongst us today. I hope that you can all hear the interpretation. I was saying that I have the great pleasure and honor to speak in the name of the President of the Pan-African Parliament, who will be back shortly. And I'm also very glad to be amongst you here today. Your Excellency, Mr. President, Kgalema Motlanthe, dear colleagues, MPs, the directors, ladies directors of UNAIDS, and ladies and gentlemen, representatives of different organizations, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor for me to speak to you here, to address you in the name of the President of the PAP and in the name of the Pan-African Parliament. I wish you a warm welcome in our continental institution. Allow me to express my gratitude to His Excellency Kgalema Motlanthe, former President of South Africa, that has honored us with his presence here, despite his very busy schedule. Thank you Mr. President. This high-level meeting comes at the right time in a context that is urgent. It is important for us to focus on HIV and AIDS, tuberculosis, and other diseases. The title of this meeting is very relevant because we are here to find sustainable and long-lasting solutions. Your Excellency, Mr. President, distinguished guests, Africa is committed through our meeting in Abuja, in Nigeria, to find solutions for Africa and to make sure that no one is left behind. This corresponds with the terms of the African Union for this year that is focusing on investing in our youth. So it is our job to protect our youth for future generations from all infections. As MPs, we need to play our role as legislators so that we can adopt the relevant budgets if we are going to save lives. The statistics are alarming according to the experts. So I would like us to think in a very practical way on a very good health cover for our populations. I am going to seize this opportunity to express my gratitude to His Excellency President Motlanthe and to all our MPs for their leadership and their commitment to fight this epidemic on the continent. I cannot end without thanking all the partners who have helped us, who are here to help us and have traveled very far. So thank you very much.
Merci, Madame la Vice-Présidente. Sans plus tarder, I will now ask our pleasure.
J'ai maintenant le plaisir de demander Son Excellence le Président Motlanthe à prendre la parole. Comme je vous l'ai dit, il est l'ancien président de l'Afrique du Sud et il est également notre champion. Je vais lui demander maintenant de faire son allocution.
Honorable Aurelien Simplice Zingas, Chairperson of the Committee on Health and Program Director for this session. Honorable Safia Elmi Jibril, Vice President of the Pan-African Parliament. Catherine Sozi, Regional Director of UNAIDS. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to join you this morning on this most important engagement. Leaving no one behind is very dear to our hearts. Therefore, the deliberations we are going to have today speak to the one most important focus of the Champions for an AIDS-Free Generation program. I bring you very warm greetings from the rest of the Champions group, and I would like to kick off my remarks by introducing you to the Champions for an AIDS-Free Generation program. We advocate at the highest political level of leadership for a commitment to ending AIDS in Africa. And all involved in the champions who drive this program come from the African continent. We encourage fellow African leaders to step up efforts and commit to policies, laws, and practices that are human rights responsive and evidence-based in the national responses. We reinforce best practices on the continent and highlight progress made. As champions, we have especially allocated time and effort to engage legislatures in all the countries we have visited, and we have convened some of the regional bodies and groupings of parliamentarians. The reason we have done so is that we are aware of the importance of their role in our national development, both Parliament, where they debate as a group and representatives and voices of all the people, and also as they engage with the people in their individual constituencies. We long recognize that without their involvement in AIDS and health development, our nations cannot go far. We also recognized that the legislatures, as determined by their mandates, define laws, debate and pass budgets, monitor implementation, and call government and the nation to account. We are all in agreement, I hope, that we cannot claim to be moving towards ending AIDS if some sectors of our population are left behind in the effort, nor can we even claim to have ended it in the future. I hope that even you here, as representatives of our communities and countries, carry the same conviction. We have made tremendous progress in Africa in terms of preventing new infections and preventing deaths. In April 2015, we as champions signed a declaration and committed to speaking out at all engagements and platforms for leaving no one behind as we end AIDS. In this declaration, we call on our nations to achieve steeper declines in new infections. We call for focus on adolescent girls and young women and young men. We commend the African Union for defining the catalytic framework to end HIV, AIDS, TB, and malaria by 2030 and fully stand behind as a crackling. There's a crackling sound there.
Qu'est-ce qui se passe?
Johannes. Okay.
Ah, c'est bon.
We commend the African Union for defining the catalytic framework to end HIV and AIDS, TB, and malaria by 2030 and fully stand behind it. The AU annual theme of harnessing the demographic dividend through investment in youth would not have come at the most opportune time when we can see the possibility for ending AIDS. We have also called for ensuring that key populations such as people who inject drugs, sex workers and their clients, men who have sex with men, transgender people and prisoners who are at much greater risk of acquiring HIV than adults in the general population, as well as migrants, are not left behind. We have therefore found it prudent to engage different leadership sectors in countries and the region on the importance of guaranteeing access to quality health and HIV services for all. We have spoken out on punitive laws, policies, and practices that hamper access to health and information, not only for key populations, but also for young people, such as their access to education, to sexual reproductive health, on child marriages and sexual abuse. We are concerned that so many years later, we are still grappling with stigma and discrimination, which we know and have proved that it is one of the potent drivers of new infections and deaths. As our leaders, you, honorable members of PAP, it is incumbent upon you to publicly denounce these practices, laws, and policies, and address them head-on in different fora with your fellow legislatures and in your constituencies and at all times. We believe that one of the key roles of leaders is to protect the vulnerable, and therefore call on you to hold this dear to your hearts. The attainment of sustainable development goals will be greatly compromised if anyone is left behind. My fellow champions and I have tirelessly expressed our concern regarding the complacency and inaction that have characterized our leaders, development partners, and donors. It seems that AIDS came and went, but the health system is coping well. We have seen this complacency resulting in reductions and stagnations in domestic and external funding for AIDS and health in Africa. We have also observed the slow progress in increase of our domestic allocations. All of these are happening at a time when we have made significant but vulnerable progress that can very easily change our course to where we do not want to be. More than a decade ago, one of our champions, President Obasanjo, convened African leaders in Abuja, where a milestone of commitment of 15% of the national budget was to be spent on health, a commitment that was reaffirmed in 2010 in Kampala. This was a critical decision, especially designed to increase domestic funding for health and address infectious diseases hampering the development of the continent. Importantly, it was also a strong stance on ownership of the health issues in the continent. We now have proof from our past experiences that if we have a sustained and incremental investment, both national and international, then our benefits will be greater in the future. I am encouraged that today our continental legislature is here to dialogue on this very pertinent matter of Africa taking ownership of its health through increased domestic financing and commodity security. We strongly believe that the legislature has the responsibility and great potential to do so. We are told that the World Bank expects most African countries will reach middle income status by 2025. We also know that Africa boasts the largest young population. Herein lies the greatest opportunity for a breakthrough, for as the economies of these countries grow, so should their domestic allocations to HIV and health. Our greatest source of optimism for Africa, therefore, is our youth. Africa cannot do it alone. HIV and health are global challenges and should be a shared responsibility. Efforts to mobilize both domestic and international investments must be maximized. We commend the AU for its demonstration of leadership by defining the catalytic framework to end HIV, AIDS, TB, and malaria by 2030, and as champions, we fully stand behind it. Operationalizing this framework is the annual theme of harnessing the demographic dividend through investment in youth. This has come at the most opportune time when we can see the possibility for ending AIDS. We have made great progress in the past and have seen commendable reductions in new infections and deaths. We have seen commendable support from our development partners and donors. We are concerned, however, that in recent years, complacency and a shift of priorities away from HIV and health is playing itself out both among our leaders and international partners and donors. We are seeing a diversion of funding away from HIV and health to other competing priorities. The first to be sacrificed has been prevention. Honorable members, prevention, prevention, prevention is key. This should be your mantra. We cannot keep piling on efforts while the tap of new infections remains open. Otherwise, we will never win against HIV. We must focus our efforts on prevention strategies that work and work tirelessly to find new and additional ones. Most critically, we must ensure that allocations to prevention reflect this priority. Even as we do so, we must recognize the damage AIDS has had on our health systems and how it has been compromised to operate maximally. As champions, and for most of you, we have lived in the early stages of AIDS when it was decimating our populations and bringing our economies to their knees. We have seen the real truth about AIDS. We know that failure to fund AIDS is failure to save lives and failure to end AIDS. National and international partners and donors have to remain engaged and be committed and creative in mobilizing the resources required to save lives and end AIDS. I do not wish to take up too much of your time for these critical deliberations. I wish to end by wishing you open, frank, and progressive deliberations that will help to change the trajectory of AIDS for the betterment of our continent's health and development. Our message to you is that for Africa, AIDS is not yet over. It is still very much among us. However, we are now armed with knowledge of what needs to be done and how our leaders can lead our nations and continent to ending AIDS and maximizing our health benefits and Africa's demographic dividend, our youth. We know that we cannot continue to isolate HIV and that we need to ensure its integration into broader health, social, and community systems and development. Your honorable members, you are needed more than ever to achieve the Sustainability Development Goals 2016 Political Declaration on HIV and AIDS, as well as the UN AIDS Fast Track Targets by 2020. Achieving these is key to ending AIDS, health, as well as social development of our continent. We keenly await conclusions of your dialogue and how you intend to take the debates and actions forward in your different parliamentary committees and caucuses and in your constituencies. We, as the champions, commit our unwavering support in this endeavor and we'll call on you periodically for encouragement and support as you make progress on moving these pertinent issues forwards. We believe that this is the challenge upon which depends the future of our continent, and that all of us working together have the power to eradicate this menace from our midst once and for all. Leaving no one behind should be our mantra, and I thank you for your kind attention.
Distinguished invités, chers participants.
Distinguished guests, dear participants, I would certainly like to thank His Excellency for his wonderful speech, but I would also like to apologize because we made His Excellency wait. I forgot to give the floor to Dr. Catherine Sosi, Regional Director, UNAIDS.
And it's now my pleasure to ask you to give your speech. Thank you.
It's no problem at all. Your Excellency, President Motlanthe Kgalema, former President of the Republic of South Africa and champion for an AIDS-free generation, the second Vice President of the Pan-African Parliament, Honorable Safia Jibril, Honorable Aurelia Simplice Zingas Kongblet, chairpersons of the committees, honorable members of Parliament, and esteemed colleagues from the UN, international partners, and members of civil society, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a privilege and honor to participate in this high-level parliamentary meeting on achieving health targets and leaving no one behind. Thank you for the partnership. As His Excellency has just said, AIDS is not over yet, but I want to add that it can be. In the not-so-distant future, it is plausible that AIDS could be something we read about in history books rather than newspaper headlines. In September 2015, African countries, along with other member states, gathered at the United Nations, adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, and committed to ending AIDS as a public health threat by 2030. The extraordinary accomplishments of the previous years that led to the end of the MDGs inspired global confidence that this target could be achieved. It was agreed that we have a 5-year window period, only 5 years to 2020, to show whether this could be possible or not. That was 2015. At the time, the data from UNAIDS was able to show that the number of people living with HIV on antiretroviral treatment reached nearly 18 million people. In this very region where we sit today, Eastern and Southern Africa, the number of people on treatment had more than doubled since 2010, reaching nearly 10.3 million people. As a consequence of this scale-up, AIDS-related deaths in this region had decreased by 43% since 2010, something that earlier was thought unthinkable. And what does ending AIDS as a public health threat look like? For UNAIDS, the vision for ending AIDS looks like this: voluntary HIV testing and antiretroviral treatment reaching everyone, adults, children, adolescents, everywhere. Each person on treatment reaching what we call viral suppression, where the level of HIV is so low that the risk of doing any damage to the body or organs and of transmission is practically zero, where no one dies from an AIDS-related illness like TB, where no child is born with HIV, and where people living with HIV live with dignity, protected by laws, and free to move and live anywhere in the world. But ladies and gentlemen, we are running out of time. If we continue doing business as we're doing now, we're unlikely to meet the 2020 targets. We had a fragile 5-year window of opportunity 2 years ago. It is now the end of 2017. If we are smart and scale up fast by 2020, we will be on track to end the epidemic by 2030. So we look to you to support the fast-track agenda. But the situation for Africa has huge challenges. Declines in new HIV infections among adults have slowed alarmingly in the recent years, with the estimated annual number of new infections among adults remaining nearly static at about 2 million in 2015 every year. In Eastern and Southern Africa, the majority of new HIV infections occur among adolescent girls and young women, aged 15 to 24 years. Harmful gender norms and inequalities, insufficient access to education and sexual and reproductive health services, poverty, food security, and violence are some of the root causes of the increased HIV risk of young women and adolescent girls. And while the world has witnessed significant progress in responding to HIV, the Western and Central Africa region lags well behind, with only 36% of people living with HIV knowing their HIV status. Only 28% accessing treatment, and 12% of people living with HIV on treatment virally suppressed. This was at the end of 2015. The gap is considerable for Western and Central Africa. 4.7 million people living with HIV are not receiving treatment. 330,000 adults and children died from AIDS-related illnesses in 2015. In many countries, key populations, defined as people who inject drugs, prisoners, female sex workers, and men who have sex with men, HIV prevalence is very high for those countries for which we have the data. And yet, condom use and HIV testing coverage and access to services are well below the recommended value. And even as we are lauded for our coverage on getting people on treatment, considerable gaps still remain, with millions more not knowing their status and millions needing to be on treatment. The biggest catch-up we need to do of people being left behind is around men who have not tested for HIV and who are not on treatment, and children and adolescents starting and staying on treatment too. All the people being left behind must be reached. Ignorance and misunderstanding continue to undermine the efforts to end AIDS, and in the worst cases, discriminatory attitudes and behavior are facilitated by punitive laws and policies. As Nelson Mandela said, after climbing a hill, we find that there are many more hills to climb. We have been climbing this hill one at a time. Now we must finish our journey with a final climb, and we cannot lose anyone along the way. If Africa wants stability, peace, and sustainable development, we cannot run away from the needs of all persons, regardless of their gender, regardless of their race, creed, or sexual identity, or whether they inject drugs, are prisoners, whether they are migrants, women, or people with disabilities. We cannot run away from the harm caused by criminalizing populations. We cannot run away from the crisis in pediatric AIDS. We must ensure 100% treatment coverage for all children living with HIV. No child should die of an AIDS-related illness. We cannot run away from the tuberculosis epidemic. We must concentrate our limited resources on where most infections occur and where most people die. We are very grateful for the external support provided by so many external partners, including the United States President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief and the Global Fund, but also the member states themselves, who are increasingly supporting their own country responses. But we are running out of time. We had a fragile 5-year window of opportunity of 2 years. I remind you, it's now the end of 2017. We know that Africa can achieve incredible things when we set our minds to this challenge, as the fact that we have managed to do with Ebola, yellow fever, Zika virus, and polio. And this same spirit of determination, of pragmatism and optimism, which led to those extraordinary achievements, improving the lives of so many, must not be missed and needs to be embraced to end the AIDS epidemic. Honorable ladies and gentlemen, You as parliamentarians have the mandate and public trust to act in the interests of humanity. You command the respect, influence, and resources needed to secure progress. You bear a special responsibility to set the examples that spur others into action. We look up to you to pave the way forward, and I look forward to the deliberations over the today and tomorrow and the ensuing partnership. Remember, AIDS is not over yet, but it can be. I thank you for listening.
Merci.
Thank you, Madam Regional Director of UNAIDS, for your expertise. We will now proceed to the presentations that have been scheduled for today. The first presentation will be done by Mr. Sabelo Mbokazi from the African Union Commission. Mr. Sabelo.
Comme le président de la commission.
As the president of the chairperson of the committee has joined us, Mr. Zinga is here. I am the vice chairperson, and I will allow him to proceed.
Yeah. Your Excellency, former President Motlanthe, distinguished guests, and executives and excellencies from the Pan-African Parliament. Thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Sabelo Mbokazi. I come from the African Union Commission. And I'm going to be making a presentation after very inspiring speeches from the high table. And we thank you very much, you, our leaders, for inspiring us. As a technical person working in the area of HIV, AIDS, TB, and malaria, I'm very much inspired, and we feel very much encouraged as we move forward in the response, or in supporting the member states in the response on HIV and AIDS, as well as TB, as well as malaria, and other infectious diseases. My presentation is very much predicated on a wide range of AU policy frameworks. But really, before I move on with the presentation, I think it would be important for us to look at other structures that the African leaders have established specifically to focus on the fight against HIV and AIDS, and TB, malaria, and other infectious diseases. The leadership of the African Union, or the heads of states, as early as 2000, 2004, 2005, they established a structure to show that a strong commitment. They established a structure called AIDS Watch Africa, and I've got it there on the slide. And AIDS Watch Africa was established specifically to deal with HIV and AIDS, TB and malaria. That was regarded at that particular point as an emergency in Africa. And we are very much encouraged to see that up to today, we have this structure, the AIDS Watch Africa, which is a structure where the African heads of states meet annually to review the progress on HIV and AIDS, TB and malaria and other infectious diseases, to look at the progress that Africa is making in terms of these three epidemics. So I thought it was very much important because to mention this, because some of the policy frameworks that we have, the policy frameworks that have approved by this structure, and this structure has the heads of states, they meet in every mid-year summit to deliberate on issues of the epidemics in Africa and the progress that we are making. But each and every, the AU regions have got, is supposed to have a champion, but we know that the heads of states, they change time and again because of the democracy that is entrenched in our region. And therefore they change now and again. But there is a secretariat at AU, the secretariat. I come from that secretariat, the Secretariat on AIDS Watch Africa. And the president, the current president, is always, the current AU chairperson is always a chairperson of our. So that is the commitment and that is the structure that drives, in terms of leadership, that drives the fight against the epidemics and all other infectious diseases in Africa. Let me now move on to my presentation. One of the vision that Africa has established is Agenda 2063. And I'm sure we all have heard about Agenda 2063. All the work that you are doing, this is a strategic policy document that you are following in Africa. So I just want to, because it's not a very old, it's a very new policy framework. I just want to take you through the strategic pillars of the Agenda 2063. I have highlighted these strategic pillars are referred to as the aspirations. These are the aspirations of Africa. The aspiration number one, we are saying, is a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development. This is where Africa wants to go. And I've highlighted this aspiration or this strategic pillar because health and related streams of work contribute to pillar number one or aspiration number one of the Agenda 2063. The second pillar or aspiration of Agenda 2063, Africa wants to be an integrated continent, politically united and based on the ideas of Pan-Africanism and the vision of Africa's renaissance. Pillar number three, an Africa of good governance, democracy, respect of human rights, justice, and rule of law. This is what Africa would like to see themselves to be. And number four, the aspiration, Africa wants to be a peaceful and secure Africa. Number 5, an Africa with a strong cultural identity, common heritage, shared values and ethics. An Africa, number 6, whose development is people-driven, relying on potential of African people, especially its women and youth, and caring for children. Africa as a strong, united, and resilient and influential global player and partner. These are the 7 strategic pillars of Agenda 2063, and we refer to them as the aspirations of Africa. So this is the broad policy framework. And every work that we are doing in Africa, we are trying to achieve these aspirations, these strategic pillars for development in Africa. Let me move on now to focus on health. In 2016, the African Union adopted what we refer to as the Africa Health Strategy. And this is a strategy for 2016 up to 2030. It is already aligned to the SDGs. Just briefly about the strategy, I will go through the strategic pillars to see that the African Health Strategy is predicated on very few strategic pillars. This is what it is trying to achieve. The strategic pillar number 1 is expanding social protection and address equity. The second one is prioritizing human resources for health. The presentation that we had here from His Excellency, former President of South Africa, Excellency Motlanthe, as well as all the presentation, they highlighted the need and the importance of investing on health. And we can say that pillar is talking about prioritizing human resources for health. Also, the third one is essential medicines, commodity security, and supply systems. Let me move to the other strategic approaches of the Africa Health Strategy. We have to focus on surveillance, emergency preparedness, and response. We cannot overemphasize this one because we've just emerged in the recent past from the impact of Ebola that impacted the West African countries. So this strategic pillar is very much important. The following one, refocusing service delivery and empowering communities. Service delivery this is a point that is predicated very much on the health system strengthening. Africa cannot provide health services unless we focus on service delivery and empowering communities. And then the next one is multi-sectoral strategic partnership to enable better performance. Okay, so that was the Africa Health Strategy. So Africa has a strategy. Africa has a health strategy, and this is the strategy that we are implementing. But there are, in terms of the, in order to implement this strategy, we've got other policy frameworks, and one of them is the Abuja Declaration, the Abuja actions towards the elimination of HIV and AIDS, TB and malaria in Africa by 2030. This is the Abuja that was adopted in a special summit in Abuja in 2013. So it was very close to the end of the MDGs. So we are implementing this project. We are implementing this policy framework. Let me move on to the next one. grappling with this technology. Yes. This one was mentioned several times by former President Motlanthe. The catalytic framework. Catalytic framework also was adopted in 2016. The Africa, or the heads of states, adopted the catalytic framework as a blueprint in terms of the implementation or of the response to HIV, AIDS, TB, and malaria. So the catalytic framework, its vision is to have Africa free of AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. And the mission is to end AIDS, TB, tuberculosis, and eliminate malaria by 2030. This is the vision, this is the mission of the catalytic framework. But I also should mention that the catalytic framework contributes to the implementation of the Abuja Declaration. So these policy frameworks are interlinked and they inspire each other. The objectives of the catalytic framework is to eliminate malaria incidence and mortality, prevent its transmission and re-establishment in all countries by 2030. It's also to end the AIDS as a public threat, as a public health threat by 2030. The other objective is to end TB deaths and cases by 2030. So we're working towards 2030, but we need to look at the nearest target, which is 2020. I will just go through quickly on these guiding principles. These guiding principles are the guiding principles that we find in the Africa Health Strategy. These are the guiding principles that we also find in the catalytic framework. Africa leadership and ownership of development strategies and accountability for implementation are the foundation of success. The state has a central role to play in development. That's why we are these days promoting the domestic financing for health, because the state has a central role to play in development. There's also the importance of effective development partnerships are essential, as in coordination and collaboration between communities, governments, and development partners. Health is both a social and an economic asset that should be invested in and prioritized by governments. We cannot overemphasize this one. The catalytic framework is divided into 3 components. The first part, if you open the catalytic framework, the first part really focuses on the policy issues, the thematic areas that we need to focus, that we need to prioritize in our countries. The next one is about the implementation of these strategies. And then the third one is on accountability, is on monitoring and evaluation. The conference pack that was distributed here has the targets. The targets we've outlined, the target is a brochure on targets, is in your conference pack, and thanks to UNAIDS that managed to print this and distribute it. So that's why we're going to see the targets for HIV and AIDS, and the targets for 2020, the targets for 2025, and targets for 2030. Now I see a lion. Indeed, we are in Africa. The catalytic framework has a business model that is predicated on 3 areas. The first one, we are looking at focus, and the focus should be strategic investment area is the health system strengthening. Unless our health systems are strengthened, it is very much possible to provide good service delivery for our people. Strategic investment area 2 is generation and use of evidence for policy and program intervention. We are in an era of data revolution, and therefore data is the one should drive our policy implementation, that should drive our interventions at a national level. Then the next one is strategic investment. Area 3 is advocacy and capacity building. That's where we place our hope on our leadership. We place our hope on our honorable members of parliament, that they were able to do advocacy, and that they were able to, and the partners, they were able to provide the capacity building at a national